sector. Well, the government, as I told you, when we were the savings and loan regulators, we could only deal with our industry. And if people gave up their federal deposit insurance, we couldn't do anything to them. Congress may strike you as impossible, but actually did something intelligent in 1994 and passed the Home Ownership Equity Protection Act that gave the Fed, and only the Federal Reserve, the explicit statutory authority to ban liar's loans by every lender, whether or not they had federal deposit insurance. So what did Ben Bernanke and Alan Greenspan, as chairs of the Fed, do when they got these warnings that these were massively fraudulent loans and that they were being sold to the secondary market? Remember, there's no fraud exorcist. Once it starts out a fraudulent loan, it can only be sold to the secondary market through more frauds, lying about the reps and warranties. And then those people are going to produce mortgage-backed securities and exotic derivatives, which are also going to be supposedly backed by those fraudulent loans. So the fraud is going to progress through the entire system, hyperinflate the bubble, produce a disaster. And remember, we had experience with this. We had seen significant losses, and we had experience of competent regulators in stopping it. Greenspan and Bernanke refused to use the authority under the statute to stop liar's loans. And this was a matter first of dogma. They're just, horrifically opposed to anything regulatory. But it is also the international competition in laxity, the race to the bottom between the United States and the United Kingdom, the City of London in particular. And the City of London won that race to the bottom, but it meant that all regulation in the West was completely degraded in this stupid competition to be who could have the weakest regulation. So that was the regulatory response. What about the response of the prosecutors after the crisis? After $11 trillion in losses, after 10 million jobs lost, a crisis in which the losses and the frauds were more than 70 times larger than the savings and loan debacle. Well, in the savings and loan debacle, our agency that regulated savings and loans, OTS, made over 30,000 criminal referrals, produced over 1,000 felony convictions just in cases designated as major, and that understates the degree of prioritization because we worked with the FBI to create the list of the top 100 fraud schemes, the absolute worst of the worst nationwide. Roughly 300 savings and loans involved, roughly 600 senior officials. Virtually all of them were prosecuted. We had a 90% conviction rate. It's the greatest success against elite white-collar criminals ever, and it was because of this understanding of control fraud and the accounting control fraud mechanism. Flash forward to the current crisis. The same agency, Office of Thrift Supervision, which was supposed to regulate many of the largest makers of liar's loans in the country, has made, even today, it no longer exists, but as of a year ago, it had made 0 criminal referrals. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is supposed to regulate the largest national banks, has made 0 criminal referrals. The Fed appears to have made 0 criminal referrals. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is smart enough to refuse to answer the question. Without any guidance from the regulators, there's no expertise in the FBI to investigate complex frauds. It isn't simply that they've had to reinvent the wheel of how to do these prosecutions. They've forgotten that the wheel exists. And therefore, we have 0 prosecutions, and of course, 0 convictions of any of the elite bank frauds, the Wall Street types that drove this crisis. With no expertise coming from the regulators, the FBI formed what it calls a partnership with the Mortgage Bankers Association in 2007. The Mortgage Bankers Association is the trade association of the perps. And the Mortgage Bankers Association set out, it had the audacity and the success to con the FBI. It had created a supposed definition of mortgage fraud in which, guess what, its members are always the victim and never the perpetrators. And the FBI has bought this hook, line, sinker, rod, reel, and the boat they rode out in. And so the FBI, under the leadership of an attorney general who is African American and a president of the United States who is African American, have adopted the Tea Party definition of the crisis, in which it is the first virgin crisis in history conceived without sin in the executive ranks. And it's those oh so clever hairdressers who were able to defraud the poor, pitiful banks who lack any financial sophistication. It is the silliest story you can conceive of. And so they go and they prosecute the hairdressers, and they leave the banksters alone entirely. So while lions are roaming the campsite, the FBI is chasing mice. What do we need to do? What can we do in all of this? We need to change the perverse incentive structures that produce these recurrent epidemics of accounting control fraud that are driving our crises. So we have to first get rid of the systemically dangerous institutions. These are the so-called too big to fail institutions. We need to shrink them to the point within the next 5 years that they no longer pose a systemic risk. Right now, they are ticking time bombs that will cause a global crisis as soon as the next one fails, not if, when. Second thing we need to do is completely reform modern executive and professional compensation, which is what they use to suborn the appraisers. Remember, they were pressuring the appraisers through the compensation system, trying to produce what we call a Gresham's dynamic, in which bad ethics drives good ethics out of the marketplace. And they largely succeeded, which is how the fraud became endemic. And the third thing that we need to do is deal with what we call the 3 Ds: deregulation, desupervision, and the de facto decriminalization. Because we can make all 3 of these changes, and if we do so, we can dramatically reduce how often we have a crisis and how severe those crises are. That is not simply critical to our economy. You can see what these crises do to inequality and what they do to our democracy. They have produced crony capitalism, American style, in which the largest financial institutions are the leading financial donors of both parties. And that's the reason why even after this crisis, 70 times larger than the savings and loan crisis, we have no meaningful reforms in any of the 3 areas that I've talked about, other than banning liar's loans, which is good, but that's just one form of ammunition for this fraud weapon. There are many forms of ammunition they can use. That's why we need to learn what the bankers have learned, the recipe for the best way to rob a bank, so that we can stop that recipe, because our legislators, who are dependent on political contributions, will not do it on their own. Thank you very much.